so it's this tension between like wanting to create enough momentum through your actions, through the scenes that you're playing, to like manifest the change in the community, while also acknowledging that you're just one person, and these shifts aren't going to come, or aren't always going to come, unless sometimes you burn yourself out.
Welcome to the Draw Your Dice podcast, the show that calls on the champions and new contenders of the tabletop RPG arena. My name is Jeremy Gage, and I am learning about tabletop game design and publishing. If you are a budding game designer or a veteran looking for fresh musings, stay tuned as we learn about the inspirations, processes, and philosophies of professionals in the industry. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on this episode of Draw Your Dice. I believe this is episode 7 off the top of my head, which is great because that's 6 more than I thought I would have. So I'm very proud of that. Today's guest that we have, that you can hear giggling in the background, hails all the way from the Lekwungen territories over in Canada and British Columbia. They speak at, or they have presented work at QGCon, and they present themselves as artist and activist. I'd like to welcome to the show Paolino Caputo.
Hi. Thanks for having me, Jeremy.
Of course. Paolino, before we start getting into the game things, would you give a brief introduction of yourself as you present yourself to the world for the folks who are listening?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so as you heard, my name is Paolino Caputo. I also go by Lino, and my online handle is Magnolian. And I am a queer and non-binary artist and activist living on Lekwungen territory, as Jeremy mentioned. I am of mixed Italian ancestry, and I also identify as having some psychosocial disability. And I am so excited to be here today and to share some of my work.
Amazing. Oh, I'm so excited. Me and Lino have been in a couple games together. I've been play testing, and I've actually talked about your game a couple of times, A Quiet Moment, in different episodes of the podcast. So, yeah. Right? Am I messing up the title of that game?
Oh, it's so A Quiet Moment. I do like that title, but currently it's Travelers. Although I am aware, or I became aware recently, that Travelers is also the name of a very old RPG or something.
Yes, yeah.
So I am definitely looking for other ideas for names, and that one totally works for me.
Well, I have referenced it 3 different times under that title. So. Ground floor title, everyone. I'm a goof. No, yeah, I am super excited. I think the games that you've created that I have been exposed to are really amazing experiences. I think you have a really cool knack for creating an emotional response in the players at the table. Me and Lino have played a couple of games together so far, both playtesting their game and also running some trash anime, MMO, isekai inspired. Not trash. It's not trash. It's a good game, but
be honest,
Charles, if you're listening, I don't. Yeah, trash anime taste for sure. But we've been hanging out in the Brain Trust for a while. So, Lino, the first thing I sort of like to do on the show is remind people that game designers are more than just the sum of the games they create. Mm-hmm. So would you kind of talk about what brought you to tabletop games in the first place, and then sort of what inspired you to start designing the games you've created?
Yeah, for sure. So I really came to tabletop game design, I guess, rewind a few years. And when I went so I'm like an academically trained artist, for whatever that means. So I went to university, got my Bachelor of Fine Arts, and during that process, I really studied a lot of, I was primarily interested in performance art and like new media work as my primary modes of working. And so that was like took up the majority of my studies. It's not as though the program I was in at Thompson Rivers University was particularly like well funded in those departments. It was kind of like independent study for a good chunk of it, which ended up working out really well for me, actually. I felt like I was able to explore things in a really like flexible and intuitive way. And it wasn't until sort of like going on my like third or fourth year that I started looking at game development and kind of like bridging this interest that I had going into the program with like what I was actually doing in it. So initially, when I enrolled in the fine arts program at TRU, I was thinking about being like a concept artist for like digital games. And well, I found that like I still do illustration and I still do drawing and painting in like smaller scales. I found that there was something about like the critical and philosophical element to the fine arts program that really spoke to me, and like kind of like something clicked in my brain. So then in that latter part of my education, I was able to switch gears a little bit, and I launched an independent research project under the UREAP program there, which is the Undergraduate Research Experience Award program. And I did research around queer play, the idea of using role-playing games to explore one's identity. And as part of that, I designed my first tabletop game, which is trash and is not easily accessible, thankfully. But it was a really big learning experience and got me into designing tabletop games in a really tangible way. And so when I actually get down to designing tabletop games, a lot of times I find myself really thinking about those experiences or the feelings that I want players to have. And this sort of harkens back to like my background in performance art, where I am thinking about setting up situations. I think about role-playing as kind of like a participatory sort of performance where I'm creating the instructional work or the circumstances under which the performance can take place. And so that's sort of how I start off all my designs, is thinking about that experience and then constructing the elements, the instructions, and the things that can like directly invoke that experience as part of the process, and then turning that into a game.
Wow. We had I am multiple people. Ugh. I had Adira on the show earlier in the series, in this season, quarter. There's a lot of stuff to figure out, listeners. If you're, by episode 14, I'll finally nailed it. No. But what I like about her input as far as navigating sort of, as you coined it, queer play, it was really, for me, it was really eye-opening to see how that translates into... For me, I questioned a lot about trying to... What do I want to say? This is going to be a long train of thought.
Take your time.
Thanks. I can edit out all the dead air. I wanted to know more, and I know that off-air... not shamelessly saying, but I'm shameful that I don't know more, or I'm not more educated about sort of the queer experience. Not that I think this is me not trying to put my foot in my own mouth, but thinking less of any individual because of how they identify themselves. But I can't say that I am well versed in navigating that pond, if you will, swimming in that pond or holding that conversation. So when I spoke with Adira about why she creates some of her games, she likes to put that identity, explore her own identity, and present that identity through her games, and in her lyrical games specifically. Not specifically, but I think most present in there. So I find it really interesting that there's this sort of term that you've coined, or I don't know if you've coined, but this queer play experience, and I really like to tap into that. But could you also explain to me what new media is real quick? Because I'm not familiar with that art form? Question mark.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, new media is just, I mean, it's kind of a weird term. It's just referring to like art made using digital means. So things like digital video and photography or digital installation. It's sort of like a mishmash of new tech, and sometimes it goes, I mean, that was sort of like the extent of the kind of stuff that I did, but a lot of times it involves things like projections and interfacing with tech in different ways, which I feel like is sort of tied to my interest in like the speculative aspect of my work as well.
Thank you for that explanation. I didn't know, and I'm sure there are people who are listening that don't know. So basically, to sum it up, new media is essentially digital media.
Yes.
To as a catch-all.
Yeah.
Sure. Great. Well, then let's start diving into Glass and talking about the experience and sort of the nugget ideas and mechanics of this game, right? So what was sort of the sparking, why this game? Why create this game?
Yeah, so after I had gotten out of university, I spent like the first, oh gosh, it was a long time post university where I was kind of navigating this sort of like aimless 20 somethings where you're trying to figure out like what you can do, where you're going, like what sort of futures you can make for yourself. And it was this experience that I had where my partner, he has a car, and which is like he has a car, and so he would drive me around because I wasn't able to drive because I don't know how to drive standard. I do have my novice license. Anyways, so he would drive me around, and I would be sitting in the passenger seat, and I would be looking out the window and sort of like like solemnly like thinking about my place in the world and what that meant. And there was this experience that would occur over and over again where we would be driving around and I would look into these windows of these buildings, whether they were residential or like office spaces, and I would just imagine what it would be like to live there or to inhabit those spaces, to actually like lead a life where that place was part of it. So it was very much like a Sylvia Plath fig tree moment, though. For those of you who don't know, the fig tree in Sylvia Plath, there's like this image in the middle of the novel where she's imagining all of these ripening figs on this fig tree, and she's like thinking about all the possibilities out in front of her, where she's like, do I take this one and be like a housewife, or do I take this one and be like a new woman kind of thing? But as she's sort of like pondering these possibilities, there are other figs on the tree, other possibilities that are continuing to ripen and fall off, and sort of those possibilities are removed. So it was that kind of idea where I felt like I only have so much life or so much energy, so much like there was a real existentialism about it, that I was trying to figure out like what sort of possibilities did I have in front of me, and why didn't I feel like I could access those? What was it about me or about my experience that was like limiting me from like following all of these different lives that I wanted to lead? So I wanted to, in a very real way, replicate that for others. And so that's where I started dreaming up like, okay, how do I get other people to look at windows, to imagine their own possible lives, their own like potential queer futures, and then follow those trains of thoughts? And that's where I kind of thought about like divination in a real way as being like a tool for reflecting on those possibilities. And so I sort of like thought about that divination aspect, and then pulled from like story prompt based role playing from games like The Quiet Year, and allowed that to inform the design, which was all about like drawing a spread of cards and sort of like using this window as a focus for a possible future, and then gradually having them break.
Yeah, I think when I read through the game, I I started playing. Like just reading through the game, I already started playing as I was reading it, which I think is really great of any text of a system that's presented in front of me. You know, when I read things like Blades in the Dark or D&D, like some stuff just like kind of glosses over and I'm not really like playing until I'm playing. But this is just like as I read each step, as I read each mechanic or rule piece of it or prompt piece of it, I found myself thinking about this imaginary place, and it was a really cool feeling for sure. So how I'm gonna be blunt here for a second. I want to really examine how to bring this navigation of queer identity into other games that are not being represented by queer individuals. How to create that experience or that safety net, whether that is explicitly written in the rules or gender left out completely of the writing of the game. I guess my current question is, since it looks like this is sort of your motif, your full endeavor in creating games and creating your art pieces, what is your opinion for people who don't identify as any sort of queer typing or may see themselves as cis in nature? How do you think we could go about writing stuff, or maybe not writing stuff, in our games to say everything is welcome at the table?
Mm-hmm.
Everything and everyone.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely one of the the big questions of the decade, it seems. I like to think a lot about the sorts of material that other queer authors have produced. When I think about work from other game designers like Avery Alder and Lucian Kahn, there's a real sense of multiplicity in their work, where even when they are thinking about community or thinking about... I recently did a full read-through of Visigoths and Molgoths by Lucian Kahn, and it was really exciting seeing the ways that the universe was just like embedded with like these little, I guess, like seeds of queer conversation, where you are thinking about things like what kinds of pronouns the characters are using, but also how they are presenting, how they're existing in the world. And I feel like I, as just like one person, can't necessarily provide like a satisfactory answer to like the full conundrum, but there's a quality of like embedding that queerness in like the minutia that I think is really valuable, where people can... it does two things. It allows queer players to latch onto things that say like, you are welcome here. This is safe. This is designed for you. This had you in mind. And then it also for like cis and het players provides like space for them to see that really explicitly existing within the structure as well. One of the things that like the big name RPGs tend to struggle with is the idea of presenting like these stories in ways that don't permeate the entirety of the work itself. I think about like, what was it? I don't even remember the name because I don't follow D&D very closely, but that recent book where they said that something about like true diversity or whatever would take years to implement. Yeah. And it's that kind of hesitance to really go full force in integrating it and weaving it into every thread of the structure that I feel gives people the leverage to either deny its existence or to like resist its existence in ways that doesn't create a safe environment for everyone at the table.
Yeah, I think what I want to say is that I agree. I think it's important to explicitly state that this game is a safety zone for any and all people who are coming to the table, and anyone who doesn't agree with that can pretty much shove off, as far as I'm personally concerned when I think about designing my games. And really a lot of these questions are coming from me as a designer, but I think these conversations are important to talk about for anyone that may be listening to this podcast. Part of the secondary reason that I'm having this is so that people can get the perspectives of many different designers coming from all walks of life. And while I know it's a big and maybe an unfair question to ask you, what can designers do better to include queer navigation into their games, I think I'm going to ask that of everyone who thinks that is an important piece of game design, because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that everyone can play. That's how I see it. I want everyone to be able to play at the playground. Yeah. And you bring up the D&D thing. There was actually I had some players where, what was the game? The adventure is Waterdeep Dragon Heist, for anyone that knows the adventure. There's a character in there who identifies as they, and I think that's the first character in the adventures that I've seen. But when I presented the character at the table, and the players I played with came from a pretty heavy video game, MMO, like early 90s, 2000s sort of style video game. And when I presented we disbanded our group over this.
Great.
When I presented the character and they were pressed for conversation, in the book, it defines the character as someone who prefers to be known as they. And my players, both in player and in character, reacted with, well, that doesn't make sense for the English sentence structure, so I'm just going to call them by their name. I was like, well, no, because that seems like you're ignoring what it is they want as a character. And then it like sparked outside of the game and just came to this really, really bad conversation that ended in a D&D, in the ending of a D&D campaign. But like
a great time.
It's a beautiful time. But basically what I'm trying to do is extrapolate that there are still currently people who are not okay with the idea of that experience being in their games and do not want to have anything to do with it. So, this is not exactly the same, but it's even things like I identify as Black, so I would love to see more games, more media that exalts, is that the word I want? Exemplifies Black American culture, speaking strictly to American culture, and being able to tap into those roots without getting stereotyped or getting jokes or assumptions made about my character that kind of fall from the bandwagon of identifying the poor Black American in America. I think it's unfair and it makes me feel bad. So that's why I thought that it might make that character feel bad, and then that's what caused that larger conversation. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important to identify that things need to be explicitly said so that there is no trepidation of or line walking of like, well, I'll just kind of ignore it. No, don't ignore it. The game's not telling you to ignore it. The game's telling you that it's here to stay. So get used to it or get out, right?
Yeah.
And the future is coming as far as I'm concerned.
The interesting thing about that too is that it seems like one of the things that I sort of pick up on in that conflict is the fact that it is this isolated incident and is like this one character who uses them pronouns, as opposed to like a world filled with people like that. There's like the whole idea of normalizing these kinds of things as like common practice in games, I think is part of the strategy of like making these spaces safer for players to exist in. And yeah, that's something that it's also weird. I mean, I'll sort of harken back, I guess, to I have a friend, Jerry Ambers, who's a Kwakwaka'wakw elder, and she does a lot of like spiritual healing and social work in different communities, both within her own community, but also she works with several organizations here on these territories. And one of the things that she frequently talks about is this sort of self-reflexive process that we all have to go through to really to heal those ancestral traumas, and then to be able to work through the layers of, I guess, like social dynamics, or the layers of power that exist in the world when we are thinking about people existing at different intersections of identities. The work that Jerry does often invites people to really look inwards as a way of changing how they continue along their journey. I'm not even sure if I'm able to put the right words to it, but that process of learning and being critical of oneself is so important. And one of the things that I really think about in my games as well is like this idea of encouraging other people to participate in that process, that like either investigation or just like contending with these factors. And it's not even something that I sort of embed consciously, but it kind of like shows up in different games. Like when I think about Glass, or even back to my first game as well, there's sort of like this happenstance in playfulness with one's own identity that begins to happen. And that's something that I feel is really important when you're thinking about like the overall social implications of games as well. Like how are we encouraging players and the people playing the games to be able to evolve their own lines of thinking, evolve their own lines of self? Because some people have like really transformative moments with games that I think, like I also want to acknowledge that games aren't like gonna make anyone change their identity, like, but there is a certain poignancy in being able to actually conduct that performance that I think has a kind of potential in it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that given the proper space or latitude, games, like you said, can be very transformative, both in a therapeutic sense, but also in an exploration sense of ideas of, I always like to coin that there's only two types of characters you can make: the one you are and the one you want to be. And I think what that allows is for, I have many players now who explore sort of different sexualities through their characters, and I think, or I would like to believe that they do it tastefully. They haven't been kicked off my table yet for doing anything truly insulting, but I can't pretend to be the end all be all of what I know to be queer stereotyping or not. But I find it really beautiful in a way that, because I can see that when they make these choices with their characters, they're also sort of making these choices through themselves. I think for some of my players at the table, I can see the moments where they're like, would I actually do that? Not asking the question like, this is what my character would do, but it's like, this is what I would do. This full blend of player and character decision making happening at the table. And I think those are very beautiful, and I think even more importantly, normalizing moments for the culture of tabletop role play, speaking to it in a vacuum. I don't know if this bleeds over into board games or anything of that nature, or even video games. I think video games still have a long way to go for that sort of, and when I say, I mean like MMO RPGs and things like that, where they don't really care about those pieces of the puzzle. Mm-hmm. Wow. Lino, I'm so glad that we are talking today.
I'm so glad
I really
as well.
I'm learning a lot, and I'm learning more and more about my own personal ignorance as I try to talk about this. But
That's part of the process, baby.
So before we get into talking about sort of your current works or future works that you're thinking about, I always like to break up the segments with what design trends you're seeing either in your own spheres of influence, so think things like Twitter or the Brain Trust, that keep coming up that you're like, oh, that'd be really interesting if that got pushed on, or, you know, something that you're like, I hope that people don't attach themselves to this, or even some trends that you personally think that you'd like to see more of, or some trends that you would like to see disappear like tomorrow. I'm cool with the good and the bad for sure.
Oh, that's such a good question. And it's something that I definitely feel like I don't know if okay, I'm going to grab onto the things that I'm finding interesting around me, and just let that be what this
The
is.
guide.
Yeah. I've been really interested. So I have three things that come to mind.
Mm-hmm.
One, you mentioned talking with Adira Slattery before. I am really fond. The more and more I learn about it, the more excited I am about lyric games and their existence within the world. And it sort of like stems from like my performance art stuff as well. With performance art, there's always this weird tension that I experience when I'm designing like these social situations, where it's like, is the social situation itself the work, quote quote? Is the experience of it the work? Is the documentation of it that exists afterwards the work? Because that's the stuff that's going to get shown in a gallery or whatever. And so it's like this constant question of like, where does the value lie? And so the lyric games are really interesting to me because it takes something that isn't necessarily always attributed that same value of being like the work, or like it kind of denies the separation between like the game text and the game itself, which is something that I find really, really appealing. So that's a trend that I absolutely love right now, and I want to experience more of that, or like play with that more. I'm excited for that sphere. I'm also really interested in community-centered role-playing. The idea that we're not inhabiting individual characters, but rather playing with the community entirely. Or even if we are playing individual characters, it's stories about communities. And the two artists that come to mind for this are Ben Robbins and Avery Alder, as like really wonderful examples of like being able to play in community spaces in ways that explore like collective values and collective decision making. There's really like a kind of utopianism that seems to be born out of those modes of thinking that really makes me excited, because it doesn't always like revert back to the ways of existing that we're currently in, but it sort of like spreads into this imaginative space. Like, what if the world could be different, could be inhabited in this different way, which I think just like speaks to my experiences in doing like advocacy work as well. And so that's like that's my second trend. And then my third trend, I don't even know what this is. Micro games? What's the term that I'm looking for? But okay, yes. Highland Paranormal Society. So the works by artists like Highland Paranormal Society and like Bats are really interesting to me in ways that they like condense feelings into like really minuscule sort of packages and present them in a real punchy way. And there's something really liberating about being able to just like have like an 8.5 by 11 letter sheet of paper with some like scribbled notes on it, and like be like really compelled to play it. Like, oh my god, I really want to play Tunnel Goons right now.
Yes.
And it's that kind of like excitement that is super, I don't know, just something super appealing about that. But yeah, I don't even know what the title of that trend is. Have you heard anything?
No, I would say microgame is, but I also, when is a game not a game, right? When do we give it another word? So I don't want to say micro as in that they are tiny, but no, a couple things came to mind. So when you're talking about lyric games, I don't know if you've read Adira's Chair game or even the machine, the concept blows my mind. Have you heard of either of those games?
No, I mean, I've heard of them, but I haven't actually read either of them yet.
The Chair is a crazy horror game, fits on a single page. It's basically like reading a poem, and it just fills you with so much dread as the player. It's insane. And we talked about how that, like when you're playing a game like D&D, you can't force a player to feel an emotion. You can't force a character to feel an emotion. You can't create like a jump scare. You can't create dread in their hearts. Mm-hmm. But when you read Chair, dread, like when I read it, dread fills in me. I'm scared of what I am sitting on. Give it a read. If anyone's listening, go get the game. It's like $3 on itch. Great experience.
Oh, hell yeah.
And then when you talked about community games, I had Tyler Kremrine on here earlier in the series, and his game Beak, Feather, and Bone is very much this sort of a map building toolkit, but also the concept is that you play in this provided map, but you can get any map of any city or fantasy city or whatever have you. And the idea is that you take on the roles of the community members, like the miners, the mages, the dock workers, whatever have you. And you are like arbiter of those roles. And whenever you pick a building and structure it out, you have to structure it through the lens of those community members that you control as a player. So I think that stuff, it was a really fascinating game, and it's something I would love to play in like a one shot or anything like that, because it's a relatively short game. So, but it can also be campaign linked if you try hard enough. And then sort of this concept of micro games, I had Max on here, and their games, Point 6E and I always fuck up the name of this, ASCII Delve, I think that's how it's pronounced. Both of those are like no more than maybe 10 or 12 pages or so of game, and you could run months on those rule sets alone. So I think it just shows that you don't need a 300-page booklet divided over 3 books to create a successful game. I'm quoting in the air, listeners.
I feel like I'm never going to write something that large.
Same.
I'm like maybe 60 pages. Like
yeah. And that's the top end. I feel you for sure. Wow, great. Those are really good things to keep track of. And what I like about those as well is that they are styles of games. When I usually ask for design trends, it usually speaks to maybe like mechanics or themes, but what I like about your trends is that it talks about that there's not just the traditional style of the GM and the combat and the fantasy medieval, whatever have you. There are other game styles that facilitate fun, entertainment, experience. And you listed 3 that I don't think people think about on the mainstream level, for sure.
Can you tell I'm a feelings person?
No, I had no idea, honestly. Not based on your character ever, and not based on the game you had me playtest. The now a quiet moment.
Love that.
So this kind of segues over into our what are you currently working on or future projects. So Lino, I know that I have a Horizon open in front of me, and you don't have to speak mainly just to that. But I think what I'd like to explore in this segment is not only the games you're working on, but sort of what themes or, you talked about your influences from trends, if you're trying to codify those trends into the games that you're making going forward, right? So that's the kind of stuff I'd like you to touch on. So what are you currently working on? What do you want to work on? Are there any jams that you're excited for?
Oh my god. I feel like I haven't been on the jam game, or yeah, that makes sense. That's a phrase.
Okay, neither have I.
My jam game for a little while. So I participated in Adam Vass's Hex Jam earlier this year, which was fun, but it was actually like my first time putting a game out on the internet. That's actually not true. It was the first time putting a game on itch, I will say, which was a lot of fun. I was like putting together like a little game. Anyways, that's total aside. I'm really excited to work on in the coming year, combining like a few different things. One is I've got this like stream of like rituals or ritualism that seems to be showing up in my work, which I'm really excited for. I've been thinking a lot about like faith and magic and how those things have existed in my ancestry, as well as like how I inhabit them today. And so I'm really keen on like building out some rituals which I can distribute through itch instead of like games. It's a ritual, but I feel like those things are very intertwined. And then there's also this idea of like queer utopianism, which is where Horizons rests right now. And that's a game I've been sitting on for like a long time. I've just been sort of like mulling it over, turning like different mechanics and things over in my head, because I really had like the question of like, how do we manifest queer futures, or like how do we pursue and envision them? And so that's kind of where that game is beginning to take shape. I feel like I've got like some good mechanics in place and some good threads that I can pull on, but it's just a matter of like taking the time to tease them out, which is something that I'm hoping to have. This year has been a bit of a shit show in general, so maybe I will have some more brain space in 2021.
It's interesting that you talk about manifest queer utopianism. I recently tried to concoct a game that was set in like a solar punk style world, and I was doing some homework about like solar punk, cyberpunk, all the punk aesthetic / art / novel / game genre pieces. But when you talk about how, because I know in Horizon you ask yourself two questions, right? You ask, what does utopian queer futurity?
Yeah, you got it.
Cool. Sure. Queer futurity and utopianism, your two questions are, what does that look like and how do we get there? And when I was studying sort of cyberpunk was written around like the 80s, 90s period or decades. And they were people's conceptualization of the trends that they saw the world moving towards, capitalism and corporation and things like that. And what's interesting is that there are a lot of theories that state when those ideas are put into a consumable format, that they start to breed or fester different philosophies, principles, guiding ideas that make the future happen. So when I was looking at solarpunk and hearing you talk about this utopianism, we're basically creating the pieces that we want to see become our future, like our relevant reality. And I think there's something really powerful about all forms of art, writing, visual, new, right? All forms of media, that we can't see a reality unless we present that reality, that possible reality, in front of people, right? Solar punk or hope punk is under the concept that we can create a better, sustainable, environmentally friendly future with the technology we have literally right now. It's not some crazy futuristic, like we need to harness the power of the sun. And when I mean that, I don't mean solar power. I mean literally bring globules of fire back to the planet Earth. But I think it's important to identify that the work we create puts ideas in people's heads, whether that be for ill or for better. And we're only in the state that we are now because ideas multiplied from the 80s and 90s about what, at least this is me speaking strictly to American style culture. And I don't know if that speaks to global culture as well, and for what the limited amount I know about American culture. But it only became a thing because we wanted it to be a thing, essentially. We analyzed it. We said, these are some potentially good ideas, or someone said it was a potentially good idea, and now here it is. And we may not like the idea so much now currently. So
Yeah.
we would like to move into something else. So I think it's really interesting that your games, at least these current projects or future projects that you're working on, want to show people this is what this utopia looks like. And it's possible. It's literally in the next room if we try hard enough, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's very beautiful, I guess, is what my full circle is that I really like that concept of speaking the world you want to see into play.
Mm-hmm. And I really like it as well. It's interesting that you talk about like cyberpunk and its origins, because there was definitely like a wow cool robot kind of moment, like, you know, that meme where it's like the Gundam and they're shooting the laser and then it's like and the laser says war is bad. And then the person's just looking directly at the Gundam and they're like, wow, cool robot. So it's that kind of thing, but it's I really like the idea when you are thinking about hope punk and even thinking about things like Afrofuturism and just like all these different ways of envisioning possible lives. It's sort of like taking that wow cool robot moment and making it that like you can't miss the point, or like even if you miss the point, you're still bringing something exciting into the world, something that actually does care about us. And it's a little bit less nihilistic, I guess.
Yeah. Post-apocalyptic for sure. Or, current apocalyptic. That's what I feel like sometimes. Yeah, so why don't you kind of walk us through kind of how you play the current concept of Horizon? I don't know if the game is it finished? Is it not finished?
Oh, God, no. It's not
okay,
finished.
Cool. Yeah, walk us through sort of playing the game. What does that manifest experience look like?
Yeah, for sure. So Horizon, I imagine, here's another trend that I forgot to mention in the last segment. Single player or solo games are something that I'm really interested in. Love Ironsworn.
Yes, love my Ironsworn.
Yeah, it's good. So all of my games I'm trying to design for solo play. So I imagine Horizon being a game that could be played with maybe 1 to 4 players, 1 to 5 players, something like that. And it's a game where you are imagining a queer utopia. And it's not a utopia in the sense that there are no problems with it, but it's a utopia of process, one that continuously works to learn and evolve and right itself as harm is done, which is inevitable. That's just the existence we live in. And so together as a group or as a single player, you begin by imagining what community you're inhabiting. In the rules currently, I'm playing with some architectural theory as a ways for generating the community. I'm not totally sold on it, but it did crank out some interesting results in an early play test. But more core to the experience that I think won't be replaced is this idea of creating a set of shared values that your community abides by. So when you say something like we value collaborative decision making, or like consent or something like that, then you also follow that step after sort of determining those values as a group. You follow that and sort of push the limits of the values that you've determined. So you create a series of even if statements. So we value collaborative decision making even if the process is incredibly slow. And those become like tension points that will sort of present problems for your community. So then, as players, after you've got your community, after you've got your values and your even if statements, then you engage in this state of play where you are a group of advocates, or people representing different communities within the community. And as you're confronted with problems, you are able to respond to those problems I think currently it's like in a little bit of a trad way, where you've got like these 4 facets of your body, I describe it as, and it's facets that relate to like your social ability, which corresponds to like the heart in a deck of cards, or like your ability to connect with like the supernatural, or your faith or spirituality in that way, or the land. And that's, I can't remember which one I assigned that to, probably diamonds. I know my own game.
Let's see. No, you're good. Knowledge is diamond, faith is spade.
Faith is spades. Why did I make faith spades? I don't know. I look at associations for these things, and then I totally forget what the associations were.
Live design iteration, everyone. Live design iteration.
It's great. Yeah, so with these different aspects of your body, you're like tasked with sort of like solving and investigating these issues, sort of like existing within them. And I imagine that played out through a series of like Firebrands-esque mini games. There's something really compelling about the Firebrands format of like having like isolated games for each sort of scene you want to play out. That's where I'm leaning right now. And then playing out those scenes, you end up drawing a card from the corresponding deck. So like I'm solving a social problem, I'm going to draw a hearts card. And the way I have it in my head right now is that anytime you draw like a numbers card, it's like things go well for you, whatnot. There's like or not even go well, but the story progresses in a way that doesn't like shake things up. And then you hold that card. And so with every scene you do, you're drawing a card and holding it. And the idea is that if you draw, you can then spend those cards to like one card being 1 point, another card being another point, to enact like really substantial changes on your community in sort of, so it's kind of split up between this micro phase of like playing scenes as individual characters, individual advocates, where you're gathering these resources, working towards these changes, and then spending those in a macro phase where you're actually changing the circumstances that are in the community. But the problem is that as you draw these cards, if you draw over a certain number, right now it's like 20, of a particular suit, then you induce burnout. So one thing that is so just like consistent in advocacy work is burnout, and like the very real price of like putting yourself in those traumatic situations, or just like trying to enact that change in systems that don't accept it or won't, or continue to resist it. And so I wanted some way to represent that like ebb and flow of like being there, making that change, but then also recognizing like the limits and the need to rest, recuperate, and recover following those efforts. So it's this tension between like wanting to create enough momentum through your actions, through the scenes that you're playing, to like manifest the change in the community, while also acknowledging that you're just one person, and these shifts aren't going to come, or aren't always going to come, unless sometimes you burn yourself out. So there is a bit of like a sobering quality to that, I guess. And I imagine this as a campaign game very much, where it's like oscillating between these two things as you play with these characters, as you see how they evolve. Oh, and I forgot to mention the core conceit of it, which is that this is in a future so distant that it's like on a mega structure somewhere out in space, and we have like no memory of the world we live in today. We have no semblance of like the genders that we inhabit or the kinds of divides that exist here. I think about this as like a bit of a decolonial potential, I guess, or or emancipatory, I guess is like the better word for it. Emancipation from like the binds of the world that we live in today, and the freedom to like imagine whatever sorts of communities that we want. How did that make sense?
It did. How it made sense was that it did. Very good. Very good, Lino. No, what I enjoyed about that explanation is sort of listening to you talk about why the game plays the way that it does and your personal influences, because I know that you do advocacy, or you have done advocacy work. Do you still do advocacy work in regular channels?
I do. It's definitely like a different kind of advocacy. Well, I mean, is it really? I don't know. It's a lot of like internal advocacy for like the organization that I'm working with, but then with the knowledge and idea that that organization itself is like supporting other communities. We work a lot like with different like indigenous artists in the area, and like being able to create a culture that's able to support them is kind of part of my work, I guess. Not even in, I do a lot of like particularly queer and accessibility advocacy, actually. That's like, those are the two that I find myself most centered on. But yeah, it's still part of my lived experience, I guess.
Yeah, no, the only reason I ask is because the game feels like it comes from a place of experience, right? I think that you have a really good handle on translating the feelings you've probably experienced in your advocacy work and translating that to a game that I think does, at least for me, it does read well to that codification of that experience. And as you're talking about it, I think about like the Black Lives Matter movement for me, and how unfortunately only recently, like within the last five or so years, or when Barack Obama became president, is when I really took, my vote seriously. And that was when I was, how long is that? 12 years? 13 years? So how old was I? I was 18. Wow, good for me. I did vote out of the gate, but it's only recently that I started thinking about advocating for things like easier, or at least speaking to American style of voting of our federal republic that we are. We're not a democracy. No one thinks that we're a democracy. Don't get that out of your heads, everyone. But just making voting more accessible, advocating for everyone to have the right to vote regardless of status or position in the states, talking about things like immigration and why it's not actually a scary thing for these people, for any person that doesn't have a serial number attached to them. And it's really eye-opening to me, the experience for someone, I'm doing it at the skim level of the ocean. I feel like you've been in the deep undersea trenches of advocacy work, and it felt tension and conflict, and understand where it's probably hard to get your ideas heard or to get people properly represented. And when we talk about things like manifesting a utopianism and really setting the precedents for the conceit that we are already a bound community as far as the elimination of different segregations of identification in cultures are, just basically saying like now our community is based on the morals and values that we hold dear. How do we make a better community solely off of those things? And really analyzing that that's what matters, is that it's values and morals, not the color of my skin or how you would like to be identified as a person. That does all matter, but the more important factor of how community operates is what can we do to find a common goal, right? I think what I'm trying to say is that it comes to a common goal point for everyone to follow, and making sure that everyone's on the same page, and that creates a better community.
Mm-hmm. And that's sort of like the part about like the articulating your values that I really like about the system right now, is just like the ways that it does create like that baseline for like, these are the things that we will take action towards achieving. And like, maybe those values change. Like, it's not set in stone when you make it. I imagine there being a rule that I write somewhere about changing those values, especially when you do explore those tension points. But having that base understanding and that ability to be responsible to those values, because that's what this is it's responsibilizing the different actors in the community to make sure those values are met in a way that honors like the consent that people give when they're participating in the community, when they grow up or like learn those values, when they come into and inhabit the community. There's a real action that's taken in like being able to say like, yes, these are values I agree with. Yes, these are things that I will be working towards and will be holding others accountable for. And when I think about like the tensions that colonialism has introduced, there's a lot of tumult in introducing and imposing values that are shared among one group of people onto another. And so I want to recognize that multiplicity in the way that I'm designing and sort of like frame a non-homogenized vision of the future as well. A way that actually honors the differences.
Yeah, maintaining that complexity of the human connection while still removing some of those colonialistic pieces of storytelling that are currently present in our facets of media, and also how, again, speaking strictly to American culture, how we've come to understand everything, really, how we understand status and stuff like that for our communities. Really powerful stuff, for sure.
Thank you. I know you said it sounds like I'm like deep in the trenches, but really I don't. Like, really, I feel like I am also skimming the surface. There's like so much deeper I can go.
But like you said, you're only one person, and eventually by yourself, you probably will get burnt out and need to stop. So at least stop for a little bit. Yeah, and it takes a village for sure. It can't just be one person, but a single person can certainly light the spark. But it takes a wave of people to really get some change happening. And if anyone's listening to this game design is an art. Games are an art form, and sometimes your art says things that you want them to say, and sometimes they don't say things explicitly that you might be saying. But what I want to say, partially with this episode of the podcast, is that for us Americans, exercise your right to vote. You can really help at the local level and really help people out there work towards the values that you want to see in the community. So keep that in mind. I'm not afraid to put that on this show and lose listeners for it. So fuck off if you have a problem with that. So basically this section is I roll on the table, there's a little prompt of something specifically to game design, but so it could be something like marketing for game design, publishing, et cetera, et cetera. Your experience level in any prompt doesn't matter, just whatever you think the best advice, because I think everyone listening to this podcast is going to be listening at a different level set, either just beginning or a veteran who may not understand something, and you may certainly have insight that helps them. all expert level knowledge is relative to the person who's listening to it. All right. This is the 5th time I've rolled this number on this series alone, but Lino, where the dice lands, would you give a quick TLDR tip to the folks listening about marketing for your games or in game industry period?
Okay, yeah. My tip would definitely be, I would say that know the objectives of your marketing. For some people, being able to drum up sales and like being able to have a consistent audience that can actually support them financially is really important. And so if you're able to articulate that goal, then there are different strategies that you can take to go towards it. But for myself, I've found that like maybe sales aren't as important. And what's more important to me is building out like a robust body of work. And so like the energy that I put into marketing is reflective of that. There's not a lot on my end, but at the same time, it affects the style of marketing that I do. So the kinds of marketing for me is a lot of like relationship building, is like being friends with a lot of cool people and being like, hey, look at my shit. Mm-hmm. There's some really good advice I got from artist Alison Moore, who said that the advice that she wished she had gotten when she was an emerging artist was like, just talk to curators, like hit them up, be like, hey, do you want to go for coffee? Just like that networking, as silly as it is, can be really effective at being able to share your work with the people that need to see it. So yeah, start chatting with people if you are in that sphere, or put out some Facebook ads. I don't know.
Either maybe do it organic. Yeah, organic, or use the robot. Either or. No, I think that's a great tip because one, like I said, this is like the 5th time. I'm going to use a different dice moving forward, everyone. If you're getting sick of hearing marketing tips, too bad. But it's important to some effect. It's the age we live in. But you're not the only one to have stated that networking and meeting people is a pretty decent piece of the puzzle when it comes to getting your work out there, getting help, I think for me, it even relates to sales. A lot of the philosophies that I've done research on in terms of marketing, it always comes down to what value are you providing for people? And that doesn't mean just what your product is, but how do you help give back? How do you help give more in forms that aren't just a tube of toothpaste or a book or something like that? And another piece that I think Tyler Crumrine talks about this. I think Adam Bell said something to this effect, but just for me, since joining the Brain Trust, I feel my game design skills are jumping through the roof every day when either I'm listening to someone else try to get information for an idea, or I'm trying to poke around for an idea, and they just have influences that I've never had before. Like, I don't watch a lot of 80s or even 90s movies, and I see references or ideas spawning from those. My main bread and butter is like video games and anime, so if it doesn't fit in that wheelhouse, I don't know how to help you. But yeah, I think networking is a part of that marketing puzzle. I know that can be like seen as a community thing, but it's also, Tyler Crumrine talks about how he shamelessly is plugging everyone else all the time. He is constantly retweeting and saying how excited he is, or even if he has skin in the game, as he puts it, in writing a book, he still makes sure that those aren't the only pieces of content he's sharing with people. And when it finally comes to fruition that you have the courage and support to put something out there, especially like having a network of people that will support you and say, yes, this is great, put it out on the internet, like that feels really good. And when that happens, those people will probably reciprocate. Now, obviously, don't ask them to reciprocate, because that's the dirty, and we don't do the dirty here on this show. So, or, we do the quote unquote dirty. Anyways, that's a side tangent and a whole nother podcast show entirely. But it's important to connect yourself with people. I think that it is important to connect yourself with people, meet people, get new perspectives, get new lenses, and that will also help you learn more about the industry, what publishers are looking for, what marketers are trying to do, what other designers are, kind of harking back to your personal tip. You get to know what is the best bang for your buck in terms of time spent marketing, because you're asking the right people. You've connected with the right people, and they can cut off months of troubleshooting or trial by fire just by asking them.
100%. And I think that really cuts to the heart of it. And also, another little tidbit is to not be afraid of the word networking. I know there's something about that inspires the extractionist kind of paradigm to relationships, which is not great. I really think that if you do frame this around just meeting cool people, getting to know other people who are in the same field as you, who are working on similar things, there's and being able to form those reciprocal relational modes of working with them, it definitely pays off in the long run. As a community, you are able to support each other in reaching higher than you could alone. And you don't have to rely on fucking institutions. Fuck them.
Listen, I will go deep into talking about that at any point in time with anybody. Quick aside, I got a level 2 certification to be a sommelier for restaurants. For anyone that doesn't know, sommelier is basically the wine expert guy, but they're honestly just a glorified manager at the end of the day in the restaurant sphere. But people think being a sommelier means you get granted the opportunities to work on branded vineyards and be in restaurants, and you can only go to the best accreditation to make your way in the world. And that is not true. That little pin that people get, while they should still be very proud of the knowledge they have, there's a 65-year-old man in a cellar in Italy right now who never spent a day in any of those accreditations and could probably run circles around you right now with wine knowledge. So don't get it twisted that institutionalization trumps experience. I think, in my opinion, it's quite the opposite way around.
It's definitely a weird relationship those two have.
Yes, yeah. Lino, it has been an absolute blast having you here today. I certainly have learned a lot about myself and a lot about your game design. Where can people find you, chat to you, network with you? All these links that Lino is about to talk about will be in the show notes below.
Yeah, so you can find me on the web. You can find my website at magnolian.com. You can also find it just by searching Paolino Caputo Artist. Although, to be fair, neither one of those things are easy to spell, so that's fine. Good thing there are links in the show notes. And then, but you can also email me at paolino@magnolian.com. And you can find my games on itch, also Magnolian, or search Paolino Caputo. And I have a dormant Twitter account, which is Paolino_Caputo, I think. I don't even remember my own Twitter account. It's in the show notes. It's fine.
Yeah.
I also have a dormant Instagram, but that's for another day, I think.
Sure. Paolino, it's been great having you here. I really appreciate it. For everyone at home, I hope that you learned a lot, or if you're in your car or wherever you're listening to this, shower, bathroom. It's been great. Bye, everyone. Say bye to the people, Paolino.
Bye, everyone. I'll see y'all in cyberspace.
All right, that's a wrap. Paolino, you inspire me to work so much harder for a better future. I truly believe your empathy and drive for a more connected tomorrow can make the difference. Keep up the great work. All the games we talked about today, along with all the links to get in touch with Paolino, will be down below in the show notes for your access. If you liked the show and found it helpful, please send a tip my way over on Ko-fi. Or, if you are unable to donate, please consider sharing this with the person you thought of while listening to this episode and leave a review. Both of those methods greatly impact the success of this show and lets me know that what I'm doing is beneficial to designers out there. If you finally got your game off the ground and out in the world, you can tag me at JeremyGage5 over on Twitter with the hashtag #IDidIt. That's IDYDIT. Thanks for listening, and I will catch you